This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted on March the 18th, 1971. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Miss Gazelle Lane, and that's capital Gazelle Lane, capital Lane, the daughter of the doctor who delivered Will Rogers. This Miss Lane lives in Claremore, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on November the 3rd, 1986 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Yes, it is. This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. This is March 18th, 1971. I'm in Claremore, where I'm visiting with Miss Gazelle Lane. Miss Lane is the daughter of Dr. A.J. Lane, who delivered Will Rogers. Miss Lane will be talking about some of her experiences and also about her acquaintance and some of the reminiscences dealing with Will Rogers. But before we go into reminiscences, I would like to ask you to tell us about the day that Will Rogers was born. Would you do that, Miss Lane?
Will Rogers was born, as most of you already know, November the 4th, 1879. And on the day that he was born, why, some of the neighbors and friends of Will Rogers, as I might stop a minute on that and tell, there were several of the families around in the neighborhood that were just like one big family. And when one baby came into the world, why, they all tried to be the first one there to see that new baby. And Dr. A.J. Lane was the doctor in this vicinity. And on the day that Will Rogers was born, Mrs. Charlie McClellan and Aunt Ada Foreman, and they had one of their men who worked for them, they were down in the Verdigris River bottom gathering wild grapes. And the man, of course, would get up in the trees and get the grapes down. And this was just a few days before Mrs. McClellan delivered her son, Charlie, on the 10th of November. And while they were working there, getting their grapes, one of the men came across the river from Mr. Rogers' house, and when he saw them, he said, "Oh, I want to tell you, they got a fine boy over at Mr. Rogers' home." And Aunt Ada Foreman told the boy who was getting the grapes, she said, "You unhitch that horse and put the harness up so I can ride him. I'm going over to see the baby." So she went over to see the baby and left this boy and Mrs. Charlie McClellan to pick the grapes. And so she went over to see the baby, and I guess she was the first visitor that Bill had. And Dr. Lane was the doctor who delivered the baby. And at this time, there was quite a circle of old families in there who have all passed away, and most of them have one or two of the family left. And it's happened, they called on me for the Lane family because I'm the last one of the Dr. A.J. Lane family living. And as he was a doctor, I was more than happy to tell the story. At this time, we did not have papers, but we got around over the country. We'd tell our neighbors, and of course, they would go on to the next neighbor. But it was a happy happy neighborhood. Most families had from 8 to 10 in the family, and we attended the Uwela public school was where most of us went to school.
Could you tell about Will Rogers as a boy?
Well, now as he was growing up, I, as I might say, I didn't know him until he must have been 10, 11 years old. We, going across the river, we children, we didn't get to visit over there. While our parents visited, we didn't get to see Will as a boy so much. But I remember Will, the first time making an impression, we were at the Willie Halsell College at Veneta going to school, and Will was one of the boys there in school, and my sister Shasta and Tommy and myself were, and we were up in 12 or 13 years old, I guess at that time. We went to the public school, but it would be so crowded by some of them tried to send us off where we'd get more attention, I guess.
What was your impression when you first met Will Rogers as a boy?
Well, I never, you can just imagine, of course we would see Will, just like the children do today, that may be the neighbors, you know, you just maybe be playing with them, and at that time, I don't think I had any, he was just one of the boys.
Was he a clown or such?
Well, he was always full of life. He and Charlie McClellan, he was another one of the boys, and Tommy Lane, they seemed to be the ones that would always start things, and of course there was a lot of wee girls that I had this sister Shasta, then there was Susan McClellan, and then the Foreman girls, there was Jenny and Ada and Vic. Vic was very small, like she was the youngest of the girls. And it's just like a bunch of any of the children you would see today. And Will was always just full of life. And his mother died when, how old was he? I don't remember whether, I know that.
Could you tell about that day?
Well, I can remember Mrs. Rogers was sick, and my father, there'd been a lot of sickness in the country during the winter, the fall rather it was, and Papa had gone to Baxter Springs, I believe it was, Mama said. And after Ms. Rogers took sick, I don't know how old was Will at this time.
He was about 10, I think.
Well, 10, and he lived and stayed with his sister Sally McSpadden. Your Chelsea went to school for a while, and then this school at the Willie Halsell College they took the younger children, and Will was up there at school. And I can remember Will and Charlie and Tommy at school up there, and they were always seemed like the leaders, and they'd start something, and the other boys would join in.
He always
And
had a rope.
yes, he'd have a rope, and if he'd be going along, he'd rope you. And then and Will had an older brother, Robert, and he was at school, and he was Mr. Frazier, I think was the name of the person, who was going to brand some cattle, and this Robert was he was at Willie Halsell at Bonita, and he went out there, and he got too hot, and I had
The typhoid fever.
Something, it was some kind of a chill, something like that, and he died from that, being overheated. He was roping, he was just in the delight, of course, of roping cattle.
He was about 16, I think, when
I
he
believe
died, Robert.
that was Robert Rogers. But the Whalen neighborhood was always had something going, and when we'd all come home from school, well, we'd round up the crowd, and there'd be of course, Will, if he was home, he was there. And then the McClellans and the Lanes and Furmans.
Do you remember the day that Mrs. Rogers passed away?
No, I don't remember at that time, but I remember Papa had been away. He'd had so much sickness that winter he was worn out. And he had gone to Baxter Springs. That seemed to be a kind of a resting place. And Papa had gone up there. And when he came home from there, when he got home, Mama said, Papa asked how everyone was. He said, well, pretty well, but says Miss Rogers is real sick. And said, well, have an early supper. Said he just got home about middle of the afternoon. Says, have an early supper and we'll go over to see her. While he, of course, wasn't the doctor, but he was on his way over there. And when he went over, Mama, I've heard her tell this, said he started up the stairs, and as he started and coming up, and said she was lying there in their room with her back to the door. And when she heard these footsteps, said she turned, she says, there's Dr. Lane. And when Papa stepped in, she says, oh, there's Dr. Lane, but you've come too late. Papa said, oh, no, you'll be all right. He said, she says, I've been sick. I forgot what time, how many days, she said. And Papa said, why didn't you send for me? She said, oh, you went away. You were tired. You needed the rest. And said, I wouldn't have you come home. Papa said, all you'd have to have done. I said, I'd come home sooner. And Papa stayed that night, and she died that night. I can say I've heard him tell that story several times.
And tell about the old cemetery.
Oh, yes, and the cemetery then, nearly all the homes, not nearly all, but so many of them, when they had their death in the family, they had their own cemetery. And Mrs. Rogers was buried right back of the house. But before Mr. Rogers passed away, he had her body moved to Chelsea, where his two daughters, Mrs. Tom McSpadden and Miss Kathleen, lived. And he bought a lot there, and he moved her body there, and also Roberts, didn't he? Wasn't Roberts moved? Roberts. And Mr. Rogers is buried there. Their graves are in the Chelsea Cemetery.
Do you remember at the time it was rumored that Uncle Will would be buried there, the public came to the cemetery and found the old Rogers lot and began chipping away the marble from the monument on Grandpa Rogers. So the family realized then that Will Rogers could not be buried in a private cemetery.
No.
It wouldn't do.
No, I hadn't heard that. I wonder if they got that.
Do you have any Why don't you tell us about the stomp dances?
In this Uwela neighborhood, they found different families. They were all Indian families and had young folks in them. And the older ones would go away to school during the year, and the younger ones went to the Uwela school there near the Uwela store that was owned by Mr. D.W. Light. But in the summer, we would always have different kind of entertainment, and one would be a stomp dance. And the little knoll hill, this was near the McClellan home, is where we had our stomp dances. But we always got the word around. We'd let of course, the Charlie McClellan maybe would start it, and then the Will McClellans and the Foremans and Lipes and Musgroves and Lanes. We'd all dress up and go out, and little Charlie McClellan certainly was proud of his Indian blood, and he gave he had many Indian costumes. He led the dance, but Will was always there and helped us out, and we all would dance and do whatever they'd tell us to do. And this was always in the summer when all the girls and boys were home from colleges. And the Uwela neighborhood was very closely united, and it was in this community where the Indian Pocahontas Club was organized back in about, in the early part of this century.
Can you tell us about the organization of the Pocahontas Club?
The organization of the Pocahontas Club was at D.W. Light's home. They had three daughters there, Miss Nanny Light, Miss Victoria, and Miss Lola Light. And it was organized by then there was the Charlie McClellan's family, which was at home at this time, was Susan and Pink McClellan. And at the Bill McClellan home was Mary and Pearl. And the Bards lived in that community, and it was Miss Lizzie and Sally Bard were the members. And from the Lane home was Ida Mae Collins. She was Mrs. Lane's daughter. She had been married before. And Mrs. Dolly Journeycake, and my sister Shasta Lane, and myself. And the Light girls that belonged was Nanny and Lola Light and Victoria, the three. And that was organized in 99.
Where did the name come from?
Well, from the Indian, the Pocahontas was the Indian girl, you know, and so we liked that name, and that has been continued ever since. And we, for a while, and it was just the girls of the neighborhood that belonged for the first several years. But when the Sequoyah Hotel was built in Claremore, and it was dedicated, the Pocahontas Club, where they were all there, and I think that was about 19 and what year was that? I hadn't thought of that before.
Cutting scrap.
Uh-huh.
I want to testify to the.
This is Ms. Milam on now.
I want to testify to the hospitality of the Lane family. When I was a child, we didn't have cars, or at least not in the very early days. My mother and Aunt Maud had a third sister, or there were the three Rogers girls, and Aunt May lived over at Uliga. And they decided they wanted to go take all of their children and go and visit Aunt May. So my father, who was always in for anything Mother wanted, you know, took our spring wagon and ordered, what do you call them? He got the covered wagon with the stays and all, and fitted out the wagon. And Mother and Aunt Maud, with their children, drove to Uliga cross country. It was a whole day's drive. But Aunt Lou, Cutting Scrap's mother, knew we were coming, and they had a wonderful dinner for us at noon.
They got there for dinner.
Oh, yes,
Go ahead.
indeed we did. We got there for dinner, and the boys had finished their chores around the ranch, and they were all in, and we had a wonderful meal. The table was extended its full length, and it was just loaded with all good things. And then,
in the summer when they had a lot of vegetables.
oh yes, it was in the summertime. And we continued on our way after an hour or so, and we made Uliga that night. And when we got to Uliga, Aunt May had pitched a tent in the backyard, and so the children all slept in the backyard. But I remember we did that twice.
They stayed 2 days there. Go on.
Hmm?
Stayed about 2 days over there. They
Oh, yes.
And ate dinner at Adidas on the way home.
Oh, yes. We 2 days in Uliga, and then, but we did that for 2 summers, Cutting Scrap.
Yes.
But I shall always remember the Lane home was really a very lovely place. It was nestled at the foot of the hill,
Yes.
and protected against the winter winds and snows and all. And it was famed for its hospitality in all of this area.
That portion was conversation between Ms. Milam and Miss Lane. Why don't you tell, this is Miss Lane again. Miss Lane, why don't you tell us about the barn dance?
Well, we had a couple in our neighborhood, as in the Uwela neighborhood. As you know, there was the Lipes and Foremans and Lanes and Musgroves and McClellans, 2 family McClellans. And Bards, I haven't left that yet. And Mr. John Light married Miss Lulu Foreman that in January, and the next summer they were living in Talala, and they had promised us to give us a barn dance when they built the new barn. So when we all got home from school, and Will was one of them that reminded, did John promise to give us all a dance next summer? So he had his barn about finished, and he had fixed up the barn, and he fixed the, what do you call it?
This is before you put the hay in.
Yes, and before they got feed anything in, we had our barn dance. So we all went over there in wagons and horseback, just every way that we didn't have enough buggies to go around. Nearly everyone had a buggy, but it just hold about 2 or 3, and there was usually from 5 to 6 of the family wanting to go. So we danced at way late, and so someone said, well, why not stay all night? And someone said, where will we stay? And someone said, well, the 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 hotel man said, well, he had rooms for had 3 extra beds that they would let us have, and everyone, their neighbors around, would take some of us. So we all decided to stay in all of the neighborhood. There were about 20. And our mothers were with us, Auntie the foreman and my mother, Miss Lane. They were both widows. Mrs. Charlie McClellan didn't go as much, but we never left my mother and Aunt Ada at home because they were always ready to go with us. And Will was, of course, there, and he always just finished up the crowd. He could tell us so many funny things that had happened. He'd been away at school and to different places and come back, and he never failed to tell us what they did. And this reminds me of the World's Fair in St. Louis. 1904. Will was with the show on the Pike, and there was about 10 of the girls of the Whaler neighborhood went up to St. Louis at the same time, and Will was there, as I said, on the Pike, and we got rooms. There was an inn right at the entrance, and he said, I'll get you all a place to stay. So we stayed there so we could go to the show every night we were there. Dr. Bushyhead happened to be up there at the same time, and so we'd go to the show. And one night he wanted some of us to ride in the stagecoach. So we got in the stagecoach, and we were going around on the Pike there, and there's some Indians took after us in that, and wheel came off of this cab, and I wish you'd have seen us, and we just went screaming out of that, and when we got out, Will said, and we ran to that and was so excited. Will said, oh, but that's just a part of the show. And so he said that was one of the best stunts they'd had for a long time, to see me girls just running and screaming. And there was some full-blood Indians in there with us, too. And Will said that was one of the best shows they'd had.
When was the first time you saw Will perform? Do you remember?
Well,
you were telling about the first time you saw Will perform. This was in Baltimore. Why don't you tell us about it on tape?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be in Washington this was the 19, and I have to stop and think what year that was. Well, while Will was...
You went to school in Virginia.
I went to school in St. Petersburg, Virginia 1 year, and of course I couldn't come home for Christmas. So I had relatives in Washington, D.C., the Dick Adam family, and they knew I was in Washington, so they invited me to come spend Christmas with them in Washington, which I very happily accepted. And at the time I was in Washington, Will Rogers was performing at a theater in Baltimore, and he knew I was in Washington, so he invited Mrs. Adams and I over for a matinee. And so we decided to go. He said, any day you come, I'll be here performing. So we decided on a day to go, and we went over in the morning. We left in time to get to the performance at 1:30. And so Will decided that morning it was such a nice day that he'd go over to Washington, D.C. So he went over to Washington to see us. And when he went to Mr. Adams's office, he said, "Well, where are those girls today?" He said, "Well, they've gone to Baltimore." And he said, "Well, I can catch a train. I'll get back before their train leaves so I can catch them." But so when we got to Baltimore, of course, we went to the theater and asked about Will. And they said, "Well, he's back in his room." So they sent for Will. So he came when he came to see who was wanting to see him at the window. And when he saw it was Miss Adams and I, he said, "Well, why don't you all stay at home?" Said, "I was over to Washington this morning." We said, "Well, we thought we'd come over to see you here." So we attended his show that afternoon.
What did you think of it?
Well, we just thoroughly enjoyed it, and we could have sat through another performance if they'd had it. But when we got through, he took us to one of the nicest places to get a fish dinner, and he saw that we had all the different kind of fish we'd never eaten before. And so we had supper, dinner, had dinner with him that evening, and then we caught a train back to Washington. So I saw him perform, and everyone just thoroughly enjoyed him when he would come out.
What was he doing then? What was his main act?
Well, it just...
He was using his rope, wasn't he?
Yes, he'd use his rope and talk and would bring. At this time is when he was on the stage, and he used his rope a good deal, and then in his act, he'd bring out the outstanding political issues of the day, have some comment on that, and we just thoroughly enjoyed him. But we'll always comment on that, and we just thoroughly enjoyed him. But we'll always, whatever he did, it just seemed to come from his heart, and he was so happy to make other people happy.